Let's talk about the overview of our discussion today. And what I want to do right now is give you kind of a brief sketch of what's in store for us. We're going to start off by talking about how the brain ages. And in particular, I'm going to identify three major sources of brain aging. Now, people who study the aging brain, the gerontologists, neurobiologists, will describe multiple theories of aging. But I've essentially reviewed the key elements of the major theories and basically boiled them down to three. And the three really comprise the main body of today's discussion. So you could think of aging as a process that involves multiple forms of stress. So the first type of stress that we're going to look at is what I'm calling immune stress. And this, of course, involves the immune system and the notion that as we age, our immune system becomes weak, at least with respect to the production of certain cells. Another notion that often comes up in the context of aging in the brain is the notion that our body's production of anti-inflammatory molecules actually goes down, while the production of pro-inflammatory molecules actually goes up. So we're going to be looking at that, this balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory molecules, and we'll be looking exactly at how that takes place. Now, the second major type of stress that I'm going to talk about is something that I'm calling oxidative stress. And most of us already know about antioxidants, and we've heard in some context or another that they're good for you. But here what we're going to do is actually take a closer look at this notion of what oxidative stress is in the first place, and how we're going to look at how it's started in the body, as well as our body's own natural mechanisms to quell oxidation or to prevent oxidation. So understanding this and understanding the role that foods play in both producing oxidation as well as reducing oxidation are very important when we consider this in light of how the brain ages. And then the third major type of stress that we're going to look at is something that I'm calling metabolic stress. And metabolic stress, as you might imagine, involves this idea that our nutrient intake and our nutrient intake and our energy output are in some sort of imbalance. Now, again, most of us know that through the process of natural aging, we're more prone to gain weight. We already kind of many of us have already experienced that ourselves. It becomes easier to put on weight as we age. And this turns out to have some significant consequences for the brain, not just our body or our midsection, but also how our brain functions. It turns out that there are certain types of molecules that are produced by fat cells that themselves communicate with the brain and alter brain function. So we'll be looking at that idea of how metabolic stress affects brain and how this process in general is wrapped up with the aging process. And then finally, our last section will be tying all this information together and looking at strategies for protecting the aging brain. And in this section, we'll be looking both at nutrient strategies as well as non-nutrient strategies. So we'll be looking at things, for example, like exercise, and particularly aerobic exercise versus weight training or resistance training, and the beneficial effects that they can have on the brain. So what we're looking at here are the multiple sources that contribute to chronic inflammation. And again, we've already touched upon one. One was poor sleep. But there are others, and these include a lack of physical activity, poor diet, and just simply being overweight. And of course, there are environmental toxins, all of which contribute to inflammation. But the real question then is, knowing that, what happens in the brain? In other words, how do we go from being chronically inflamed, as evidenced by our inflammatory markers, to having effects on the brain? And recently, this pathway that goes from inflammation to smaller brain has been elucidated. And the pathway, to simplify things, really goes something like this. So you start off with chronic inflammation from various sources. And what chronic inflammation does is increase these markers in the blood called cytokines that, in effect, reduce the permeability of the barrier that protects our brain from irritants or toxic compounds. So this is the blood-brain barrier. I'm referring to the blood-brain barrier, which is very selective as to what it lets into and out of the immediate environment of the brain. And what happens is that when you have an abundance of pro-inflammatory compounds circulating in your blood, then the permeability of this naturally protecting blood-brain barrier breaks down. And as a result of that, as a result of low permeability, you have these inflammatory molecules or cytokines that begin to infiltrate, one more step forward, that infiltrate the immediate environment of the brain. Now, the cytokines themselves I haven't said much about, but they're basically they're basically soldiers of the immune system, if you will. And they generally come in two types. There's pro-inflammatory cytokines and anti-inflammatory cytokines. And they're basically aggregates of proteins, and they have different families, but the pro-inflammatory ones that we know about include one called interleukin-6, I should say a family called interleukin-6, and then another called tumor necrosis factor alpha. Again, very ominous sounding name, but the name, I think, suggests what it does. It promotes inflammation, and in the case of tumor necrosis factor, so associated with cancer. Now, once these inflammatory cytokines infiltrate the immediate environment of the blood-brain barrier, this in turn leads to the inhibition of our brain's ability to lay down and repair damaged neurons. Now, this is a process that we refer to as neurogenesis, and it wasn't until very recently that we understood that neurogenesis continues to occur throughout life. It just doesn't happen in the early stages of life, but even well into mid-age and beyond, our neurons are constantly, or not constantly, but they have mechanisms by which to protect themselves a lot through the loss of neurons and indeed forming new connections between existing neurons. And we call this process neurogenesis and synaptogenesis. Synaptogenesis referring to laying down new connections between existing neurons. Now, what happens, though, is that with these inflammatory cytokines in the picture, these reparative processes are, in effect, shut down. So you don't have any neurogenesis as a result of having inflammatory cytokines, and it's this process, this lack of neurogenesis, that in turn leads to that smaller brain volume that we saw in previous slides where you saw the cortical volume shrink dramatically. Well, that's a result of the inhibition of neurogenesis, among other factors. And what happens, again, with inhibition of neurogenesis is accelerated aging. So in other words, the faster the more inflammation you have in your brain, the more inhibition you have of neurogenesis, then clinically we say that this is evidence of an advanced form of aging. So this is the mechanism by which inflammation from various sources, through lifestyle factors, through environmental factors, actually leads to shrinking of the brain. Okay, so this is, again, is something that intuitively it sounds obvious, but we didn't really have all the pieces of the puzzle and the link in the chain of events until very recently.